Democrats tried very hard to get Robert Mueller to say one word in particular today, a word he bent over backwards to avoid. Even when Democrats drilled into the question, Mueller went out of his way not to say that one specific word.
At your May 29th, 2019 press conference, you explained that, quote, the opinion says that the Constitution requires a process other than the criminal justice system to formally accuse a sitting president of wrongdoing, end quote. That process other than the criminal justice system for accusing a president of wrongdoing, is that impeachment?
I'm not going to comment on that.
In your report, you also wrote that you did not want to, quote, potentially preempt constitutional processes for addressing presidential misconduct, end quote. For the non-lawyers in the room, what did you mean by, quote, potentially preempt constitutional processes?
I'm not going to try to explain that.
That actually is coming from page 1 of volume 2. In the footnote is the reference to this. What are those constitutional processes?
I think I heard you mention at least one.
Impeachment, correct?
I'm not going to comment.
I mean, come on. After making the case against Trump for nearly 7 hours today, Democratic leadership came out and said they were still waiting to decide on possible impeachment.
My position has always been whatever decision we made in that regard would have to be done with our strongest possible hand, and we still have some outstanding matters in the courts.
To talk through what happened today and what didn't, I'm joined by Josh Marshall, publisher and editor of Talking Points Memo, Jason Johnson, the political editor for The Root and an MSNBC political analyst, and Michelle Goldberg, an op-ed writer for The New York Times, also an MSNBC political analyst. Michelle, let me start with you. You and I have talked a lot about the way that leadership has navigated this. What was your impression of the hearings today and the sort of political consequences thereof?
Well, I think that, the gap between the seriousness that with which leadership talks about Donald Trump's various crimes, both with regards to the Mueller investigation and other sorts of crimes, violations of the Emoluments Clause, et cetera, the gap between how they talk about that and what they're willing to do about it has been unsustainable for quite some time. And I think that press conference just underlined how unsustainable it's become, right? You had Congressman Elijah Cummings speaking quite passionately and eloquently about the challenge to our democracy and how we're not going to let it go on our watch and people are going to be studying what happens 300 years from now. If something is that grave and of that historic import, then how do you justify saying, but we're not going to start impeachment proceedings because we don't feel like our hand is strong enough now?
Jason, what do you think?
I watched this hearing, Chris, and it was like the worst episode of Wheel of Fortune ever. Like, every Democrat was like, we've got an I and an M and a P, and they're asking Mueller to guess the clue. He's not going to say impeachment. And so I don't know if the expectation is that he was suddenly going to say it, he was going to have some big closer moment. The leadership, I have always felt, has been standing in the way of what a lot of the public is now at 40–45%. It's higher than it was before the Nixon impeachment hearings. I don't know what the apprehension seems to be from Speaker Pelosi. In her press conference, didn't make it any clearer.
Well, John Harwood just published an interesting piece I just saw, which I think basically spells out what it is. And this has been sort of what I've heard from folks that I've talked to, which is basically like Dem leadership aide explaining why Pelosi resists impeachment says too many of the 31 members representing districts Trump won can't support it. There will never be 218 in the House, the aide tells me. Like, they just view this as a raw political calculation. They've got 31 members. They've got 40 frontline districts they want to protect. They can't make them walk the plank in the vote because they think it will cost them or diminish their chances of the election. And basically, that's the calculation.
Well, I think there's an additional calculation, and that is, in Pelosi's mind, he's not going to be removed anyway because of the Senate, so why we make these people walk this plank?
Right.
But yeah, no,
that's true. That's well said.
So I think it's the combination of those two. And, I was talking to, former longtime senior Democratic staffer a week or so ago, and he made the point, like, their thinking is, 6 months from now, the presidential cycle takes over, everything's presidential, and kind of like, that's coming, so we're just going to kind of wait and get to that. It's not a great answer, but that, I think, is the answer.
This, to me, is the problem. And, Michelle, this goes back to what you call untenable. And, again, I think that strategy at a raw political calculation is utterly defensible, and someone can make an argument for it, and Nancy Pelosi knows the votes in her caucus certainly better than I do. But the problem is the kind of what feels essentially fundamentally disingenuous about it, which is it feels like there's a clock running out that's happening, and it's unclear whether, like, that's transparently what's happening. They really are just running out the clock because they think, restraint's the better part of valor, or whether they're actually going to go through the court system. And that, to me, is what's part of what's unsustainable. Michelle.
Right, and they do. I mean, they obviously think that part of this is going to go through the court system, but Nadler himself has said that opening an impeachment inquiry strengthens their hand when they go through the court system. So the idea that you kind of need to go through the court system first and then open an inquiry, I don't think it's not valid. It just seems like another excuse. Right. And the same thing that Josh just said about, putting this off because in 6 months nobody's going to care. Obviously, I don't want to second-guess Nancy Pelosi's skill at defending her membership, but it also seems to me that if you're going to make people take a hard vote, make them do it now. Because in 6 months, it probably is true that we'll have moved on to some other sort of outrage, and people are not going to be voting on the basis of a vote that their congressperson took right now.
Jason.
Yes, I completely agree. It doesn't make any sense. If you say it's not going to matter, then what's the problem with doing the vote now? And I think Pelosi has a perfect example here. You had Democrats take a huge hit in 2010 for voting for the health care, the Affordable Care Act, and it was a huge problem. Does anyone actually think that 31 Democrats are going to lose their seat for voting for impeachment? I doubt it. Impeachment is not as unpopular as the Affordable Care Act was 9 years ago. So given the constitutional needs, I don't understand this calculation.
I'll tell you this, though. Here's the thing. I think this is what they think, and it's not a bad point. They took a hit. They lost the majority over the Affordable Care Act.
But they got the
millions
affordable.
Of people got health care. They still have health care, even with all we've been through in the last 10 years. So again, I'm not defending that logic.
No, but I think that is a distinction. And I think, to Jason, to your point, I mean, I having covered that fight extremely closely, Pelosi was the one with basically the knife in people's back, pushing them off the plank, knowing that she was, because she cared that much about getting that thing passed.
People like Barney Frank were like, okay, I guess it's not going to happen after the election in Massachusetts. But the thing is, you win majorities to do big things.
That's right.
And with the Affordable Care Act, it happened. It's not perfect, but millions of people got care. I think she sees this differently.
And I think it's also frustrating to govern from the House, which John Boehner and Paul Ryan learned. John Boehner particularly. But Michelle, there's also then the question of like, okay, so the Democratic Party, all those folks that you covered in columns in the run-up to 2018 who were motivated in sort of the volunteer class, let's say, people that were going and knocking on doors, which was like, I need to be rid of Donald Trump. There's a real question about what are you doing with that energy?
I need to be rid of Donald Trump, but I need to kind of get up and save our democracy because clearly nobody else is coming to save us, right? And so what happens? Middle-aged women who are sort of used to going into the breach in their communities when nobody else is there did that for our community writ large. And so I think it's less ideological because although you certainly see people on the left, members of the squad pushing impeachment, I think there's also just a lot of outraged women in middle America who are not particularly ideological, but are so, abhorred. Let's not forget what we just saw today. We just saw today, if you take away all of the talk about the theatrics and, people's performances, another reconfirmation that Donald Trump invited Russia's help, that Russia committed felonies to help Donald Trump win, that Donald Trump accepted that help, and that Donald Trump still possibly stands to profit from his relationship with Russia, right? That is laid out, and that kind of gets lost when we're having these process conversations. We're still in an emergency, and nobody on our side, maybe except for the squad, really seems to be rising to the occasion.
Jason.
Yeah, and that's where the rage and disappointment comes from. You can't, on the one hand, say this guy is a threat to our democracy, but I don't feel like doing anything about it for a political calculation. That is the kind of swamp-like behavior that people didn't like from the Republicans or the Democrats.
And there's always the possibility that you send the message that what he did was okay, which is clearly what Trump wants to turn it into.
I think the thing that I'm more focused on is they really are pushing these legal battles forward.
Yes.
but they're pushing them forward not quite to the emergency level.
Yes,
and to me,
right.
the fact what is almost a bigger deal right now is they have said we're not going to do any oversight. And that's just not acceptable. They can't accept that.
Josh Marshall, Jason Johnson, Michelle Goldberg, thanks for sharing your time. That is all in this evening. The Rachel Maddow Show starts right now. Good evening, Rachel.
Good evening, Chris. Thank you, my friend.